Adrian Somerfield said goodbye to us, his colleagues on the staff of St Columba's, after 34 years teaching here. Of course, his association with the college began much earlier, 52 years ago in fact, when in 1941, during the war, he came here as a pupil. I'd like to start, Dr. Somerfield, with the present rather than the past.
Right.
What are your feelings now about leaving St Columba's after such a long association?
I leave really without very much regret. I've enjoyed my time here in many ways and not enjoyed it in other ways, but I feel now that I've done all I can do here and it's time to move on.
Which aspects did you particularly enjoy?
I always enjoyed my teaching. I enjoyed my teaching very much. I enjoyed working in the laboratory. I enjoyed making apparatus and finding out how things worked. I didn't enjoy very much to do with duties and games and things of that sort, and the things which I felt were a bit of a waste of time. Anything to do with teaching I always loved.
Have you seen over the years a difference in the attitude of your pupils over those 34 years?
Yes, I think so. When I came to teach, we had an upper sixth, and there were always some keen people in that. Now that has gone. I think the examination system has also very much distorted teaching, so that when I first came, you didn't hear very much about examinations, and indeed when I was a pupil here, you hardly heard about examinations at all. You were just here to work and study and generally be at school. Now it seems to me that it's examinations from day one up to the time you do your leaving certificate. It has distorted the whole educational process, made it much less enjoyable.
Enjoyable for you and the pupils, you think? For the teacher?
I don't know about the pupils, but certainly for me as a teacher, one has one's eye on the syllabus all the time, which one never used to have to do.
What about, Dr. Bannister mentioned to me your particular attitude to experiments?
Well, I've regarded both physics and chemistry as experimental subjects, and I always like to be able, as far as possible, to show the pupils things actually happening rather than just describe, as it were in a textbook, how they're meant to happen. So I have made a great deal of apparatus, and it's all lying around the laboratory now, and some of it works and some of it doesn't. But I do feel that I like to demonstrate and to show people things actually happening so far as possible.
Can we go back to the time when you came here first as a boy? George Lodge was your science teacher then.
He was.
And what was he like?
I would have thought of him as being fairly fierce in his personal demeanour, though he mellowed a great deal after that. I would say a good, solid teacher, really. Not perhaps tremendously inspiring, but I learnt a lot from him. I did my work for him. I always found him fair, and insofar as I was interested in science in those days, interesting to hear from.
You say insofar as you were interested in science, what were your interests as a schoolboy here?
Well, my major interests, my hobby when I was a schoolboy here became radio. I don't know that that had anything to do with my science teaching particularly. It was just a hobby that I was interested in. Radio and music. I suppose it was fairly inevitable that I would move to some sort of science-based career because, frankly, I was never any good at languages and hadn't at that time a great deal of interest in history, which I have now. So I think fairly inevitably I did move in the scientific direction, but I wouldn't count myself as being a scientist from the word go. At school in those days one didn't specialize at all until right at the very end. We all did exactly the same subjects in the intermediate certificate and what was then called the school certificate, and even for a year after that one carried on doing virtually the same subjects as everybody else. There wasn't the specialisation that one gets nowadays, which I think was a good thing. I think there is a tendency, not at St Columba's, but there is a tendency at other schools to specialise far too early, so that pupils lose a lot of interesting things that they could have had because they are specialising in their one particular field.
I think you surprised a lot of pupils a couple of weeks ago with your choice of poems in the Voices of Poetry, a song from Enya, a bit from Alice in Wonderland. What were your memories of English? You said more or less said modern poetry you thought was a lot of tosh. But what were your memories of doing English as a boy here?
I don't really remember very much about being taught English. We were taught by Jack Lewis, and I don't think he was frightfully effective in class. I'm sure we read books and we learned poems, but I don't really remember. I'm sure we did Shakespeare. Julius Caesar, I think, was my subject for school certificate, but I don't remember really very much about any of my teaching, except perhaps for Mr White and a little bit from Dr Willis.
You were here during the war years. How much did the war itself impinge upon your consciousness as schoolboys?
It impinged on our consciences insofar as a number of our friends and friends' friends were at the war, and we knew that we might hear at any time that one of them or a father had been killed or something like that.
And did that happen? That you heard that sort of thing?
I don't remember it happening personally, no, but a number of my fellow pupils were interested in that. The warden, that's Warden Sowby, used to invite us in here to listen to the news on the radio after breakfast every morning. And the other way it affected us, of course, was that things became rather short. Food and paper and petrol and practically everything really that one couldn't produce oneself became rather short. I personally felt that that was a little bit of a challenge. My mother had this idea that you could generally improvise, and I think a great deal of that has come down to me. If you can't actually go and buy what it is, you attempt to make it or make something else do it.
Well, could you give us some examples of that sort of improvisation as it was here in the college?
For myself or for the college? Well, for myself, of course, in my hobby of radio, you couldn't just go and buy parts. You went and bought old sets and you stuck them together, and if it worked, that was fine, and if it didn't work, you tried something else. I think as far as the college was concerned, the great improvisation was probably the use of the farm, because every patch of ground in and around the college was growing something to be used in the college, and what couldn't be used in the college was being bartered for things that could be.
What sort of things, apart perhaps from potatoes? We always see pictures of potato picking in those.
I think the college grew a good deal of barley, which was swapped for other things. As schoolboys, we weren't really into the sort of fine tuning of what was done and how things were done. That tended to be done by the authorities, and we weren't very much conscious of the steps being taken to keep us fed.
When I refer to that potato picking, my impression is looking at photographs at the time that boys had extra work to do like that, which might be outside what boys and girls today are doing, which is classes and games and other clubs and societies. Was there much of that that was brought about by the necessities of the time?
Yes, I'm sure it was. I think that a lot of that potato picking and ragwort pulling and gorse digging up would have taken place in games times. We didn't perhaps take games quite as seriously then as we do now, because travelling was so difficult. You didn't have so many away matches and so on. They were just very difficult to get to and very difficult for teams to come to us. So there was more time. I certainly remember on summer evenings after prep being sent up the deer park to do some farming operation like scutching gorse, I think it
And
was
did the
called.
boys mind doing that?
I don't think so. I think we just took it as all part of the system. I don't think we had any great feelings we're doing this for our country or our school sort of
But
thing.
you didn't think you were being exploited?
Oh no, I don't think that occurred to us at all.
Yeah.
No. I would much have preferred to be pulling up potatoes and things than to be playing interminable cricket or muddy rugby.
But did you play interminable cricket and rugby or muddy rugby yourself?
Oh yes, there was no choice. Everybody played games, except if you were in the upper sixth, you got a bit of a relief, but otherwise you simply played what games you were put on. At break every day, a list of games went up, and if you were on a rugby game, you played a rugby game. If you were on a hockey game, you played a hockey game. And it generally said run for the remainder, which meant that anybody who wasn't on an organised game would run to Larch Hill or Pine Forest or somewhere like that, and our names would be checked. It was a form of cross-country running. I never minded it because it was generally over more quickly than the game of rugby, which I did not enjoy particularly. But one had no choice in the matter, you just played.
Yes. Were there any games played that aren't played now?
I wouldn't think so. I would say we play a wider variety of games now.
Was there any soccer or Gaelic games played?
Not that I remember. If they had been, they would have been played in an unorganised, not a school way. Rather later than the time I'm talking about, there was soccer organised by the boys, which took place at weekends. We had more time at weekends because in those days the school was a full boarding school, and we only had 3 Sunday exeats a term. So far more things could take place at weekends than seem to take place now when the college is virtually empty.
Well, what did people do on Saturday evenings, for example?
Saturday evenings, I remember, was taken up with activities, which was a longer session than it is now. We could do carpentry, we could do radio club, aero club, play music if you wanted to, and sometimes it was very welcome. You could go to bed early, and all sorts of things took place on Saturday nights. There was no such thing as television, and there was no such thing as radio unless you built a radio in the radio club. So we were much more self-contained. We made our own entertainment to a large extent. There would have been groups singing madrigals and part songs and all sorts of activities of one sort and another going on. And as I would remember it, activities would have lasted perhaps an hour and a half.
So you didn't have many or so many of these big schoolroom occasions when all of the colleges together?
No, I think we might have had an occasional lecture from a visiting dignitary, perhaps a dean or a bishop from overseas who happened to be staying with the Sowbys. And I do remember a very fine lecture given by Brian Boydell on liquid air, with lots of demonstrations and things in the big schoolroom. On the whole, no. Plays took place at the end of term. They were always the end of term event. Well, nearly always. There was the very famous production of Macbeth, which I think took place in 1944.
Why was it famous?
I think it was famous because so many people remember it. It was a great event in the college's life. G.K. White in his book refers to us.
Yes.
It was produced by Somerville Large, and I think it involved virtually everybody in the school. I was the stage electrician at the time, I suppose moving in my scientific direction, and we actually got in extra lights and
But
so
what
on.
the acting was so good, or what was? It does seem to have been a thrilling experience for those who were involved in it.
I think the acting probably was good, at any rate for a schoolboy production, and I don't know really what was special about it, but it seemed to catch everybody's imagination at the time. We only did the one performance, and a lot of visitors came, and we had special music, Joe Gruco and Tom Lancaster playing sort of specially composed music, and as I say, the special lighting and the effects. And we were desperately short of electricity, and we hadn't really been able to have a full final rehearsal with all the lighting because the college just didn't have enough electricity to put on more than one performance. We were very closely rationed. That was another way. You mentioned how did the war affect us, and electricity being rationed meant that things like playing the organ were very considerably curtailed. After I did my school certificate, my parents said I could learn the organ because I was always interested in the instrument, and I think we had 1 hour's practice a week, which we had to record rather carefully, and chapel services were very often held to a piano rather than the organ, simply to save the very meagre ration of electricity which the college at one time had.
Getting back to the play, I think some of the largest played Lady Macbeth, is that correct?
That's right, yes.
Had boys at that time any self-consciousness about playing girls' parts or women's parts in plays?
No, I don't think so. There were no girls in the school, and we took it for granted that if there was a play of any sort, girls' parts would be played by boys. Joe Gruco used to put on musical comedies of one sort and another. I was in one of my very first productions, I remember, was one of his, I forget the title of it, but I know one of the scenes involved the good ship Stephanie Ann. Stephanie Ann was Joe Gruco's newly born daughter at the time. And the first one I took part in with David Hannon was called Jack and Jill and the Drainpipe. And I played Jill. And David Hannon, who would have been a much more, at that time, effeminate-looking boy, he had a lovely alto voice, naturally played Jack. It was all a lot of rubbish, of course, in the way that all Joe's musical comedies were. The memory I have is of Joe sitting at the piano. These plays were never written down. They were all in Joe's head, really, sitting at the piano, smoking away and laughing his head off at the antics going on at the stage with Jack and Jill carrying a huge laundry basket around. I forget the plot, if there was one. I think the plot was probably just to have a good time.
In later years, particularly in Warden Gibbs's time, there were a number of staff productions of Gilbert and Sullivan and the memorable pantomime, The Quest of the Golden Stick, in which you played a prominent part. But did you enjoy doing those?
In retrospect, I enjoyed it more than I thought I would. I didn't, on the whole, like the idea of going on the stage very much, but when I was on and everything was going well, yes, I really quite enjoyed playing the policeman in Pirates of Penzance, and what other parts did I play? I forget now offhand. In Ruddy Gore, I remember. I had quite a decent singing voice, a little bit rough perhaps, but at least it carried, and I didn't particularly want to do these things, but when I was on the stage, particularly when I was on the Golden Stick doing the Warlock, yes, I enjoyed doing that, and letting off great bangs at Fraser Morris and Gurdon and so on. Yes, that was fun, yes. It was fun when it got going, and it was a great relief when it was all over.
Going back to the 40s, you were here under Warden Sowby, whom you've mentioned a couple of times.
Yes.
Do you understand why he appears to be a controversial figure, even in retrospect? A figure about which there are differing opinions?
There were very differing opinions in the school in the days when I was here. There was a sort of clique. They were centred around the people who published Why Not, and who considered themselves very intellectual.
These are pupils now, are they?
Pupils and one or two members of staff. And they seemed to have a feeling that Warden Sowby was perhaps a silly little man who was not worth respect, and made fun of him on every occasion. I was never involved in that. I don't think I had strong feelings one way or the other. I always felt that Warden Sowby was very fair with me. As far as we were concerned as boys, he was just the warden, and that was that. I know some people did dislike him. I think the fact that he was an Englishman, occupying a post in an Irish school, told against him in some quarters, that he was a clergyman with slightly higher church practices than was normal in the Church of Ireland, I think was noticed with some disdain, candles and things like that, which were then not fashionable in the Church of Ireland. I think many people thought that he was a person who went out ingratiating himself with other people. People didn't like his calling on President de Valera, for example. There was an air they thought of perhaps sucking up about that. In retrospect, I feel that he was the man the college very much needed. And if Warden Sowby hadn't come, I don't think we'd be sitting here now, because the college was in a dreadful state when he came. Of course, we as boys didn't know that. We had no appreciation of that at all. And I think he did great things for the college. He got money in, he got pupils in, and I have really, at present, nothing but great respect for him. But I know other people have not that respect for him, and among boys who were here, who I met at the recent dinners, there were some who didn't think very much of him. It's very hard to know. Warden of St Columba's must be a very isolated sort of position. But he was always fair with me. And
did you have any personal dealings with him as a pupil?
Not a great deal. He taught us some classes, particularly religion classes. We got our exeats from him, and perhaps as we grew up a bit more, we came across him more. He was the sort of ultimate authority, but really the housemaster, in my case, G.K. White, was the person we came across most. You would only have been referred to the warden for some particularly serious crime, and on that I never got found out, so I didn't see him in that way.
You mentioned the fact that he was an Englishman in Ireland. Did you feel in the college at that time there was a feeling that it was very definitely an Irish school, even though it had close links with the British system?
No, I don't think it was a tremendously Irish school. We had a large number of boys from the north of Ireland, and I would still think that there was probably a bit of unionist tradition still hanging about. The British ambassador, for example, would have come to St Columba's Day, and those people who were fighting in the armed forces would have been fighting in the British armed forces. A few later on perhaps joined up with the Irish armed forces, but on the whole I would say a lot of people in the college still looked towards Britain and the Empire. Many of the parents of people in the college would have been active in what one might call Britain and the Empire in those days.
What did you feel yourself? Did you feel yourself Irish?
No, well, I don't think I am. My parents came from the Midlands of England. My father came to Ireland in 1913, and my mother came just after the war, after they were married. And I've always thought of myself as being British. I have a British passport, and I suppose I still think like a Brit. When I went to England to work for 6 years, I didn't feel I was going anywhere particularly foreign. It all seemed quite natural.
Did you ever, you're going to spend your retirement years here in Ireland?
I expect so.
Yes.
We did at one time think of travelling, buying a house in England and going back there, but that's rather fallen by the wayside, and personal reasons and family reasons, I think now we should probably stay here.
Yes. What did, you mentioned your time in England before coming back here as a member of staff. Could you tell us how you came to come back to the college as a member of staff?
Yes, well, I'd been through Trinity. I'd done my PhD. I was working in an organisation called the Chemical Society, which was a learned society, and I was working as an assistant editor, a very junior person there. We'd built a house in Reigate, and we were all settled down really to live there. And then out of the blue, I had a letter from Warden Argyll saying that there was a post becoming available at St Columba's College because George Lodge was retiring. They had had no applications for the post, although it had been widely advertised. And apparently Dr. Willis and Mr. White had suggested that I might be interested. So really the invitation came out of the blue.
Did you have to think very carefully about it? And indeed, did Angela have any reservations about your accepting it?
I had to think about it a little bit, not particularly hard. My parents were still here, and it was in a way quite nice to be coming home. It would have been an entirely new kind of job because I hadn't been teaching, although I'd done some lecturing during my research years in Trinity. It was much harder for Angela. We had, after all, just, as it were, settled down. We built our house, we had our first daughter, and it looked as if we were probably going to stay in Surrey, not very far from Angela's mother at the time. So I would say that it was a harder decision for her than it was for me. I felt I probably wasn't going to get anywhere very fast at the Chemical Society. I had been thinking of moving to some other job, and this seemed to me a very attractive proposition. So I phoned Warden Argyll and said I was interested, and he came over and interviewed us both. He interviewed me in London, and he interviewed Angela and Jane down in Reigate.
And did Angela ever regret the choice, do you think, the decision that you took?
It's very hard to say. I know she was a bit miserable once or twice at Christmas and times like that, being away from her mother and father, but in fact she went over quite frequently. In those days it wasn't really very difficult to get over to East Grinstead, where her home was. Yes, I think she had some regrets, but she never really showed them, and we had tremendous help and support from Joyce Lush, who lived next door. And I think, on the whole, she's quite enjoyed her life in Ireland. And I think now, with the way that so much seems to have gone wrong in England, we're really quite glad to be here.
When you came back to the college in 1959, did you see many changes from when you left as a boy?
No. The college was bigger. It was still very much a boys' boarding school. There was a different headmaster. There were differences in detail here and there. But on the whole, I would say that it was very much the same school. It was organised in much the same way. There were 4 houses instead of 3. But you could certainly recognise it as the same school. We all went to chapel twice a day, and we wore surplices, just as I remembered it. There was an air of plenty, which I hadn't remembered because so many restrictions on supplies had gone. I would say that it's very much more different now. There have been 2 tremendous differences, I think, in my time: the introduction of girls and the introduction of day pupils, and of course the development of television, all of which I think have had a tremendous effect on the college.
For good?
In some ways, perhaps, and in some ways not. The college is much less a sort of closed community than it used to be.
What about particularly the introduction of girls? Do you remember what your own attitude personally was when it was mooted and when it happened?
I don't think I had much of an attitude. I just accepted it, that it was something that was going to happen. I had my daughter Jane, who was quite keen to come here. She was one of the earlier girls, so it really suited me very well. I don't know that things had been really thought out very well before the girls came, but I think they meshed in pretty well with the college at the time, and of course there were very few of them at first. There were only 4 in the first year. Now, of course, it's grown to be something like a third of the college.
And do you approve of the general principle of co-education as you've experienced it here?
I think so. I have some slight reservations because I think girls and boys develop differently at different ages. Whether it's my teaching or not, I don't know, but I have noticed that the number of girls remaining in science is still rather fewer than I would like. And I'm not sure whether this is actually due to something innate in girls and boys, that girls tend not to do the sciences and boys do, or whether it's environmental, or what the reason for it is.
The other big development, of course, in Warden Argyle's time, for you, was the planning and the building of the science building itself. Could you talk about how that came about, and the raising of the money, and indeed the way it cost so much more than was anticipated?
Well, it came about primarily because of the very small size of the biology laboratory.
But was most science teaching done there?
No, there were 3 laboratories when I came here to teach. There was the chemistry laboratory, which was under the big schoolroom, what later became Armstrong. There was a very nice little physics laboratory up in what is now Beresford House, in what had been staff bathrooms and the day room, staff bed-sitting room. The very nice little laboratory up there which George Lodge had designed and John MacDonald had built. And then there was this very small biology laboratory, which had originally not been intended as a full-scale laboratory at all. In the days when Warden Sowby was here, we had quite a tradition that boys went from here to study medicine, and it was felt that the school, almost uniquely among boys' schools incidentally, ought to teach some biology, at least to those 5 or 6 people a year who were going on to study medicine. So the biology laboratory, which has now just been knocked down, was in fact designed as a laboratory for 5 or 6 people, for which it was ideal. But when biology started to be taught all the way up the school, and we had classes of 25 in there, it became an absolute absurdity. And Mr. Macmullen could hardly do anything in the way of practical work because there simply wasn't the space. When I came, in fact, he hadn't even got a supply of hot water in that laboratory for washing up. So it was very primitive. So somewhere about the late 1960s, the fellows took a decision that there ought to be a science building which would release these other 3 rooms, and that it would be a good idea to put the 3 sciences into one place. This called for the raising of funds, for which we had an appeal, and we also had to have an architect. I wasn't tremendously involved in the design. I always felt it was very much an architect's solution to an architectural problem rather than an architect's solution to a science teaching problem. Mr. Macmullen and I had some input. We were asked to go and look at the plans, and we were asked in broad outline what sort of facilities and so on we would like. And when it came to planning details like benches and gas supplies and electricity supplies, then we were very much consulted. But over the general outline of the building, that was very much a matter settled between the fellows and the architect and the quantity surveyor. As it's turned out, it's been a pretty successful building. But I did have reservations at first because I did feel that the internal fittings particularly were more elaborate than they needed to be, and I felt that a lot more money was being spent than was actually necessary. But of course I wasn't involved in the details of that because the fellows and the architects really settled all that between themselves. I believe the building cost something like £66,000, but in fact I've never been able to obtain a full breakdown of the costs and the funding of that building at all.
Moving on to the arrival of Warden Gibbs, Martin Argyle's successor, you have described it as a jolt to the staff. Well, what are your memories arrival and the effect it had on the staff?
Well, it was a terrible shock. I suppose we had been coasting along rather nicely under Warden Argyll, and I imagine that discipline in the college had faded a little bit in his later years. My own memory of it is that Warden Gibbs came with tremendous goodwill. All the members of staff, as I remember it, were really very keen to welcome him. We invited him to our houses for meals. We really welcomed his arrival. Not that we had anything against Warden Argyll, but we sensed that there was something new coming, and we gave Warden Gibbs a tremendous welcome. Now, fairly naturally, Warden Gibbs started to change a lot of things, and I think my feeling about it was that no matter how hard you worked, if you worked 25 hours a day and 8 days a week, you still couldn't have satisfied him that you were working hard enough. He expected the staff to be here all the time, all weekends, all the time. And to give him his due, he was like that himself, because he himself worked himself terribly hard. I think he at times made himself ill that he was working so hard. But the feeling of goodwill and euphoria very rapidly evaporated during his first term. I don't think it was his fault, it was just his way of doing things. But at the end of the first term, there was a meeting of staff when many of us actually considered joining the ASTI because we felt that we were being very much overwhelmed with all the extra duties that we were expected to carry. Just one example there. In Warden Argyll's time, one did duty. One came on duty at 7 in the morning for breakfast, and one went off duty after about 6:30 in the evening. And one master was on duty the whole day. And he really had very little to do except supervise lunch and generally be here. Now, when Warden Gibbs came, there were extra meals. There was the coffee break in the mid-morning. There was the tea break in the afternoon. We were expected to supervise prep. And in fact, the day became broken up at first into 2 lots of duty. The number of staff didn't increase, but the amount of duty, extra work, one way or another, very much did.
You had children here under Warden Gibbs, principally Paul and Nigel. What did they think of him as a warden? Or would their perception
I've never really talked to them about it. I think they just remember him as the warden. Now, Jane had been here 1 year in Warden Argyll's time, and she experienced the first year of Warden Gibbs. And I know she wasn't very happy here in her second year. A lot of the privileges that she had looked forward to in her 6th form year, like having a common room and being able to cook and that kind of thing, were suddenly taken away, because a lot of those sort of frills of college life Warden Gibbs did abolish very quickly. And I don't know that Jane was very happy here. I think both Paul and Nigel probably knocked out a fairly good time here. But I don't really know. They both became prefects. They never really talked to me very much about their life in college, frankly.
Do you think that David Gibbs will be, how will he be assessed by posterity in terms of his wardenship?
I think he'll be assessed as a very important person. I think probably the college did need a tremendous kick to get it going again, and I think it needed somebody who was more knowledgeable about perhaps girls and the way of the world than Warden Argyll had been, to steer it through the period when girls in college were becoming more common, when the staff was becoming more mixed. And I'm sure his somewhat abrasiveness was probably just what was needed at the time. I would say we didn't like it, but we probably agreed that a lot of the things had to be done. He was very keen, he was very keen on getting boys out to do things. He bought the minibus, for example, and he took boys out walking, and he was keen on mountaineering and rock climbing, and he got sailing going, and he got canoeing going, and all sorts of outdoor activities he was very keen on, and he led them. I mean, he didn't just simply say somebody else do all these things. When I say that Warden Gibbs drove us, I do want to make it clear that he very much drove himself. If you came up here at night, for example, you would quite often find him prowling the grounds, taking a very great interest in everything that was going on. I think he came to have a great interest in and love of the college, but when he came, I don't think he liked what he found. I remember his first assembly in Big Schoolroom when he was reviewing the results of the recent O-levels, and he told the fifth form that he thought they were a thundering disgrace, which was perhaps not the most tactful way of beginning a new wardenship. It was very much the shape of things to come. So it was a great shock, but we learned to live with it. We bowed with the wind, and we survived. Most of us, one or two of us didn't, Joe Gruco, for example. But on the whole, the college went on, and it learnt new ways. I think a lot of the things that he did were very good. Again, we didn't like them. All these Saturday activities, a completely programmed year when house speeches and house plays and things like that came in, that every weekend was taken up with something, and he rather expected a good proportion of the staff to be here. He regarded them as college events, and he expected the college staff to be here.
What are your memories of the common room over the years, during your 34 years of teaching life? In your farewell speech to us, you talked quite a lot about the common room and the changes and what you got out of it.
Well, I got a lot out of it in the way of meeting some very interesting people. I mentioned, as you say, Oisin Kelly and, of course, Joe Gruco and earlier Brian Boydell. And yes, it's always quite good conversation in there. There were far more people, far more men there who had their meals there at night. The evening meal in the common room was often quite a big event, because all the living-in masters under Dr. Willis tended to have their evening meal there. It was a place of refuge. You got away from the boys, and just as now, they weren't allowed to come to common room. Changes, of course, as I mentioned, with the intrusion of the telephone and the fact that it seems to be more like a station waiting room than an academic common room now. It was quite an academic sort of place. In fact, the whole college was a more academic place when I came back here to teach than I find it now.
Do you find academic standards mediocre now?
Possibly. It's very hard to say. I think every generation looks back on its own youth as a sort of golden age when we really worked, and nobody does anything nowadays. I think there's a tendency in all the exam work that we do. People who devise exam syllabuses seem to me to be very much concerned that everybody should pass. And I think to that extent there is a decline in absolute standards. Now, I know with the grading system it means that only the good people will get grades. So perhaps it isn't as bad as that. I do remember several quite big upheavals in syllabus design for the sciences, and I would feel that the present science syllabuses are not as demanding as those we had perhaps 10 years ago, but those were in their turn very much more demanding than the ones that were in place when I first came.
A legend persists about your being a communist, about your rebel youth. What is the truth behind that?
I think there's a lot of truth behind that. I think you have to remember that in the Second World War, the Soviet Union were our allies, and many of us felt that communism perhaps wasn't necessarily all that bad a thing. I think we felt that capitalist Europe had led us into this wretched war, and possibly the Soviet system, socialism or communism, had something going for it. And I think many of us were interested in that. I was never a card-carrying communist. I don't think one could be. I don't think there was such a thing in Ireland. But yes, I certainly read Marx's Das Kapital, and I read the Communist Manifesto, and I received, it was quite easy to do, I received a monthly news sheet, which I think came from the Soviet embassy in London, and I would say that I was quite interested in things socialistic. Maybe this was to some extent a reaction against my parents or the system. I don't really know. I remember taking part in a debate here in college in which I took, if you like, the communist line, and Arnold Bradshaw and others took very much the opposing line, and in fact we had a jolly good debate. There were several of us. There was Roy Johnson and Fred Marshall and Dick Stringer, who's now dead, who also had an interest. And indeed, many of the people like Connor Farrington and so on were perhaps a little bit pink. They mightn't like to admit it, but they were. And I think many people were at that time. Now, when I went into Trinity, I had similar ideas to this. There was a meeting in the Mansion House at which the Dean of Canterbury, who was known as the Red Dean, he was very much a communistically minded person. He came and he spoke to, it was a public meeting at the Mansion House, and I was roped in, along with many of the others, to act as ushers at that meeting. We were members of the Fabian Society and things like that, and I didn't really think very much more about it. I suppose as I got a bit older and I had to study for my degree, I took a bit less interest in communist affairs. But I think even today I would regard myself as, in many ways, of liberal persuasion. Now, this came home to roost because in 1962 I won a scholarship to go to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology for a 4-month study period. It would have helped me with my PhD research, and I very much wanted to go. So I applied for the visa in the normal way, and I booked my ticket on the Cunard line, Queen Mary, to come home, the Mauritania to go out. And the night before I was to go, I was told that the United States Embassy here had refused my visa because they refused to give any reason. They said they don't have to give a reason, but the consul had advised that no visa would be issued to Adrian Somerfield, either now or at any time in the future. And as far as I know, this still holds, because we went to Canada in 1969, and I applied for a visa to visit the United States. I only wished to cross the Niagara Falls to go to the other side. And the answer was still no. Adrian Somerfield's name is still in the computer, and he is regarded as an undesirable political person.
What did you think of that? Or what do you think of that?
Well, in the earlier case, of course, the United States were in the grip of McCarthyism, and more or less anything could happen. Charlie Chaplin, all the rest of it, we were all fellow travelers and so on. The fact that it still continued to apply and was still being applied by the land of the free, I thought a little bit strange. Whether the situation still applies, I don't know. I haven't any particular interest now. But I would still say that I would not necessarily regard every aspect of communism as necessarily evil. I think one has been made to confuse the communist system under Stalin with the ideals of communism and socialism. I think there are still very great things to be said for the idea of common ownership of property, public control of, or at least a public input to things like industry and transport and radio and so on. I think unbridled capitalism, which we've now gone back to under Thatcherism, is showing, with unemployment and all these other evils that are coming about in the world, that uncontrolled laissez-faire is not necessarily a very good thing. We're seeing a backlash against it now in right-wing movements here and there. I wouldn't be surprised to see the Soviet Union becoming an even more fascist state than Nazi Germany had been. But that's all in the future, and I don't really know. But certainly, yes, I would say that I definitely had, and I wasn't unique. Many people in the late 1940s had a leaning towards socialism.
People here in the college too? I mean, you mentioned...
There was a group of us here in the college, and there was a group of us outside. After all, you must remember there was a tremendous landslide in Britain from the Tory government to Labour at the end of the war, and although the Labour government wasn't communist, it did have some socialist principles. Socialised medicine, nationalisation of the bigger industries. I think it went too far. I think the pendulum swung too far in that direction. Pendulums are always swinging, that's what they do. But I would say, yes, I certainly had interests and leanings in that direction.
Getting back to the college, you stressed in your speech to us the importance for you of chapel. Is it because of a Christian conviction or another reason?
I wouldn't really regard myself as much of a Christian. My mother's family in particular were very much Church of England. I had an uncle who in fact married us, who was a priest in the Church of England. And my mother always took me to church, so I have some ideas. I'm used to going to church, put it like that. And of course, for the last few years, I've played the organ over in St Thomas's, which gives me an interest and exposes me to a large number of sermons. But I'd hardly regard myself as being a born-again Christian, or indeed a great Christian. I perhaps know the language. I don't know that chapel has very much to do with religion, though I'm sure Mr Heaney wouldn't agree. The point I was trying to stress at the talk I gave just as I left a few days ago was that I thought that in this particular college, chapel was a sort of collegiate event, the only event really where the whole college is now together, a daily event. And I was just trying to stress that I thought that the whole college, as far as possible, should be there.
What else has it meant to you in terms of sermons, chaplains, things that have happened in chapel, music in chapel?
Well, the music in chapel, of course, took an enormous upward turn in a way under David Milne, which has been kept going. We had a lot more unusual music and different settings of things. Yes, I've always enjoyed the music in chapel, and I always think the choir has, on the whole, been very good. I'm not denigrating Joe Gruco at all when I say that. The music in his time was very good too. For myself, I rather take the view that at no stage in one's life can one ever possibly know everything. And I think the young man who says, I don't believe in God, and I refuse to believe in God, is really saying more than he has any right to, more than anybody has a right to, until they've really thought through it and know a great deal more. So I would generally regard my going to chapel and Sunday chapel and sermons as being in the general way of learning more. I mentioned Bert Walsh's sermons. I've always found that he has interesting things to say and provoking things to say that make you think. And I think, if nothing else, going to chapel should make you think. In my years here as a boy, I always found chapel a place where one could go, some of us did, and just be quiet. It was a quiet place, it was always open, and I liked it from that point of view. But I would think of chapel as being a place where one can learn, One can also be private, funnily enough, although we are all there together. You can have your own private thoughts, and you can pray or not as you like. I think one aspect of chapel that is important is that it very much supports the boy who would like to be a bit religious, perhaps, and would like to say his prayers, and who perhaps would be a little afraid to in dormitory or in other places because of what other people might think. It's a place where one can be private with one's thoughts. And I think it's very much a part of school life, and I would hate to see it go. But I wouldn't say that I'm a heavily Christian person. As I've said before, I think I'm a fairly liberal-minded sort of person, and perhaps that does stem from my original religious upbringing by my mother.
As a final question, what would your message be for the college as it enters its fourth 50 years and moves towards being 200 years old?
Oh, that's a very difficult question. I think there's a tendency these days, there's so much nostalgia around. I referred in my talk recently to the nostalgia industry. And I think there's a tremendous nostalgia for the past, not only in the college, but in the world as a whole. There's an awful lot of looking back on the good old days. We have all these sort of festivals and things around the country when we tend to look back into the past. And to some extent, the college has been looking back into the past, reasonably enough, over its last 150 years. I think the college will have to look ahead. I think it is looking ahead with this development fund and so on, and it will have to try to steer a balance between the forces outside which are tending perhaps to lower academic standards. And I think somehow it has got to try and retain academic standards, whatever ministers of education and so on might do, and whatever new rules and so on are applied to it. I think the college has a future, but we do have to remember that the future of the college depends on there being people in the world who can afford to pay the fees here. We see an aspect of that already in the large number of foreign pupils that we have in the college. And I think the college probably has a part to play in Europe in welcoming these people, provided they don't ultimately swamp us. I think the college must remember that it is an Irish foundation. It is founded in the Irish soil, if you like, in the Irish landscape and among Irish people. It must remain loyal to that, but at the same time it mustn't become insular. It must look out and welcome people in, and indeed send people out properly prepared to live in the world as it is.
Dr. Somerfield, thank you very much.
Pleasure.